and welcome to Worth Quoting, a program of Florida Community College at Jacksonville. I'm your host, Kathryn Birmingham, Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences at the downtown campus. And with me today is Dr. James Fraser, Professor of History and Education at Northeastern University and Dean of the School of Education at Northeastern. Welcome.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Good to have you here.
Very good to be with you.
I would like to go into a little of your background. I have personally enjoyed using your books in my education classes for years, especially the history of education, and I really am very happy with some of the social history work that you've done. We can certainly learn so much from that in across the liberal arts curriculum. As a scholar and as an author, you've been saying some very provocative things lately about the whole state of education in this nation.
It's gotten me in trouble a couple times, but that's all right.
In 1999, you wrote and said of the American education and the training of teachers, "We teachers have sometimes been our own worst enemies, and we have too often deserved the criticism directed at us." And in particular, in three areas, you've been very critical. We failed to be sufficiently rigorous in terms of content, this charge that we spend too much time on how to teach and not enough on what to teach. We failed to embed our programs in the daily life of schools. We've taught about schools rather than in schools. I want to hear some more about that. We've taught our students as if their students would be middle-class European Americans when, in reality, many of tomorrow's teachers will teach students of extraordinary racial and ethnic diversity, often in urban areas. Well, let's hear about that.
Well, I would stand behind all three of those critiques. I think the good news is that I'm far from the only person making this critique, and more programs, teacher preparation programs around the country are responding to this kind of critique, so that it may still be a minority of the programs if you look at the whole country, but there are lots of places that are really focusing much more on content as well as pedagogy and teacher preparation, that are moving to embed more and more of the teacher preparation process in schools, so that it's not just sort of student teaching at the end, but year after year students being in schools and then coming back to the campus to reflect on that. And more education programs are focusing on the needs, particularly of urban students, but also in other areas of rural students. We are making progress. I think we're making it too slowly, and I think our critics in the Congress, in many state legislatures, among school boards and parents continue to be frustrated with us. But I certainly have a happier story to report on teacher preparation in 2004 than I might have any time throughout the 1990s.
Well, this is a sobering and frightening indictment of the nation's colleges of education, if I understand your message here. What can we do, and what must be done to turn things around? And are there strategic issues that have to be addressed? Are there actions that we can take? When we look at the urban educator of the future, what sorts of things must we provide? Well, for different people from their different perspectives have been trying to address these issues. The Congress has certainly addressed it in Title II of the Higher Education Act, which requires teacher preparation to be much more clearly linked to the arts and sciences on campus, and which provides federal funds to support that, as well as federal funds to support engaging teacher preparation schools, colleges, directly with school systems. So there's been pressure from that area. I think among those of us who are teacher educators and who are active in the national movement around reforming teacher preparation, we need to address each of these areas, and we need to address them separately. So let me speak for a moment about each of the three. I think it is a fair criticism, if you look at teacher education in the United States in the 1970s, 1980s, that the pendulum had swung too far toward, quote, methods courses, toward engaging how to teach. And those are critical skills.
In the last decade, it's certainly swung back, and teachers need to know how to teach. There's no question about that. They also need to know their subject matter very, very well. If you're really going to be an effective mathematics teacher, you need to not just know sort of basic algebra. You need to know calculus. You need to have a confidence in yourself as a mathematician. In my own field as a historian, you need to not just be, quote, one chapter ahead of the kids. You need to feel like you have a real sense of American and world history, so that when the student asks the off-the-wall question, you can go there with them and turn that into the teachable moment, and you've got the self-confidence to do that. I believe very strongly that teachers need either a double major or somehow a major in an arts and science discipline. We have got to find ways to engage the arts and science faculty, not just to tell, and we can't just tell our students, take some ed courses, take some arts and science courses. We need to engage the two faculties working together as one unit in the preparation of the next generation of teachers. In the same way, we need to engage in partnerships with our school systems. We can't move to an apprentice model, and I think there are some who advocate sort of, well, let's just plunk bright people into the schools, let the schools mold them. We need the critical distance that colleges and universities provide, but we need to engage our students in the schools and have it be a constant back and forth about being in school classrooms, being engaged in a novice level in teaching in those classrooms, and then coming back to a seminar where you can reflect on that, critique it, ask some hard questions about what's being modeled there, and keep moving back and forth.
Sounds like you're broadening the notion that maybe some of us have had traditionally about being a teacher. What is the profession of teaching?
I think we are only going to improve the schools of the 21st century if we quite dramatically broaden our understanding of the profession. We can't have an apprentice model where you sort of learn the tricks of the trade by doing it. We need people who have much more critical distance, who are dissatisfied with schools as they are, and who say, this is not good enough. We need schools with higher academic standards, and we need schools in which the teachers really have a sense of the skills needed to engage students in learning. Much as I've been an advocate for strong arts and science disciplines, for arts and science partnerships, for high-level content knowledge, there are also people who are great historians or great mathematicians who can't teach, who can't engage somebody else. It's got to be a both and, where we are at the same time helping our students, those of us who teach educators, think about their students. How do they learn content, and how do we help them engage in that kind of learning? This is a much more sophisticated profession than teaching has ever been before.
So you want to see a greater dynamic between theory and practice and the discipline of education and the traditional liberal arts disciplines?
Absolutely. And I think we need to do, the traditional teacher preparation curriculum of the 80s and 90s, you spent several years doing some arts and science courses, some education courses. You had one semester of student teaching, and then you're certified for life as a teacher. That assumes human learning in a kind of progressive mode that simply is not the way we humans learn. So I think we need to unpack teacher preparation and think about, for those who can do it over 4 years in a college, how does the freshman get into a classroom, learn some things, come back to the college campus, ask what's going on, reflect on that, and back and forth. And after a person is certified, how do you continue that so that the teacher is engaged in a real lifelong learning process?
And what about this notion of the urban school? How is that a different environment or a specific environment for which these professionals must be trained?
As part of the critique that you read at the beginning, I feel like teacher preparation still in many places, and certainly for a long time, has prepared people to teach in middle-class suburban schools where, in fact, the majority of children today are not growing up in those kinds of schools. They're growing up in urban areas for the most part, in some cases in rural areas. They don't necessarily come from middle-class backgrounds, and majority of kids in many states are not white. We need to embrace that, not as a, quote, problem to be solved, but as an opportunity. These are the children of the future. How do we build on their strengths? How do we make connections to their communities? How do we find ways to not just honor them with lip service, but be truly engaged in their lives? You and I were on a conversation before we went on this, where we talked about how do we engage people in the churches, in the community organizations, in the civil rights community, in seeing themselves as having a vested interest in teacher preparation. And then how do we as teacher educators get our students connected to those people so that they will see themselves. We can't do teacher preparation just between the college campus and the schools. We need community-based organizations engaged with us in teacher preparation and in shaping the teacher preparation process.
So you want to see some thought and action then in grounding our students in the urban context?
Absolutely.
Is that what you're saying?
Grounding students in the urban context, helping them love the urban context, helping them be engaged with and enthusiastic about teaching city kids who bring such wonderful range of experiences and opportunities, but we need the skills to tap into that.
Now, how do we get the schools to buy into this? Because obviously we need their assistance to ground students in their reality.
Well, and I think the hardest part with schools, the challenge in engaging as teacher educators with schools is that most school teachers came up through teacher preparation programs. So when we start talking about this, they have a sense of how it ought to be. And we need to invite teachers and school administrators to work with us to say, the way it's been in the past isn't going to work for the 21st century. So let's collectively reinvent the profession and the preparation for the profession. At the same time, I think the hardest notion for schools is that we want the next generation of teachers to have a certain critical distance. It's not good enough to go into schools and be able to work in schools as they are. We need our graduates of our teacher preparation programs to go into schools, be able to work in schools as they are, certainly, but also to ask, why aren't these schools better? Why aren't we being more effective with the kids who seem to get left out, left behind, the quiet one in the back of the classroom or the one who quit showing up the third week of classes? So there's always going to be a tension. I think it's a healthy tension. I think schools are constantly pushing teacher preparation programs to say, you're not preparing the teachers that we need. That's a healthy pressure for us. On the other hand, we have to have a role, and we have to ask our school partners to welcome the role, that our role is to ask hard questions and to engage our students to ask hard questions so that they will go into schools and be themselves change agents. And then we need to be bringing the community in as a third partner with that, with their own questions, with their own expectations, with their own saying, you know, there's too many kids for whom these schools aren't working. What are we going to do about it? And we need that sense of urgency. If there's anything that frustrates me, it's that we've all been sort of willing to work at a fairly polite rate.
We're preserving our academic objectivity,
Our academic objectivity, when there are kids who are not learning to read and write and do mathematics, and therefore whose futures are terribly circumscribed. And those kids are graduating from school every year.
So these teachers of the future, these urban educators, need to be much more comfortable in dialogue with community groups, church groups, nonprofits, and the policy making of their institutions. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's absolutely right. I think we've created teaching in too many cases as a passive profession. We teachers sort of go about our business. We teach in our classrooms. We assume somebody else is doing the community work, and we assume some policymaker somewhere off in Tallahassee or Boston is dropping these policies on our head. We teachers and teacher educators need to take a much more active role. That is more than just, Jim saying, let's get active. It is all of us reconceptualizing this profession.
That's a big job, Dr. Fraser, and I'd like to hear about what you've done at Northeastern University to address some of these issues. You're talking about creating a new school of education that functions very differently, obviously has a different curriculum. You talked about linking the disciplines, being practice-oriented, requiring urban and community partnerships, and how do you do that at the same time recruiting and retaining and supporting these new teachers?
Well, we at Northeastern were given this extraordinary opportunity 5 years ago in 1999 when the university decided to restructure its teacher preparation programs, close some of the old programs, and launch a brand new school of education. Not many people get that opportunity, so we've been fortunate and need, therefore, to hold ourselves, I think, to an even higher standard of accountability around that.
You're under the magnifying glass.
We ought to be under the magnifying glass because of the support and the opportunity we've been given by the university. The first thing we did was to tackle the content issue, and so as we were launching the new School of Education, we made it not a separate unit, but a unit of the College of Arts and Sciences, not like a department, but a cross-cutting unit. So there's the College of Arts and Sciences, and sort of cutting across it is the School of Education. Within the School of Education, the majority of our faculty are people drawn from other departments with joint appointments. So the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs is a chemist, we have biologists, we have mathematicians, historians, who have accepted joint appointments and accepted a role in helping craft the future of teacher preparation. That's more than an administrative structure. It's a way of saying and bringing to the table in every conversation people with expertise in pedagogy, people with expertise in content, and making them mutually responsible for the preparation of the next generation of teachers. And I think one of the most important things has been to pull the pedagogy people more into how do we talk to the content people, but for the content people, helping them think about, helping in my own experience as a part of the history department, how do we think about preparing every single history major at Northeastern, not just with a knowledge of history, but with a knowledge of how to teach history and make it come alive and make it be exciting for others. So that step one was to link to the arts and sciences.
How long did that take?
Well, because we were in a kind of crisis in 1988 and 99, we were able to do it in 1 year. It's taken 5 years, and it's going to take longer than that to really make it work. We still have conversations 5 years in. Okay, now we've got all these folks. We have joint appointments. What does that really mean? How does it work in a university's reward structure? How do we help it roll out long term so that somebody does it not just for a year or two, but for the next phase, as a college professor, for the next phase of their career? So we are still in our infancy about that. At the same time, we found that we had students at one point in 70, for a small ed program, before we launched the new school, we had students in 70 different schools. We've consolidated that down to 6.
This is all within the city of Boston.
All within the city of Boston. We have 6 partner schools, all urban schools. For us, very fortunately, mostly within walking distance of the campus because we're a university right in the middle of the city. Those schools have begun, again, we launched it in 99. By the end of 99, it was done in terms of on paper. Now in 2004, we're having some very deep conversations about what does it mean for those 6 schools to really own part of the teacher preparation program, and for us as teacher preparation people to be responsible not just to plunk our students into those schools as student teachers, but if we're going to have that kind of deep partnership, we need to say as a university, we're accountable. We're accountable as a university for the achievement of every student in those partner schools. And if we can't be accountable in that way, if we can't make that work, then it's the wrong kind of partnership. And I'm delighted, only 5 years in this year, for the first time I've heard principals in those schools saying back to me, talking about our students, meaning the Northeastern students, not just the students in their school. That's a shift in thinking.
Oh, certainly. It's a broad commitment, and I can see that the curriculum change must have been huge. Now, tell me about the partnerships with these schools. What sorts of things are you doing?
Well, we started out at the most simple level. We said to some schools, we want to work more deeply with these schools, and we had a superintendent who backed us in doing that. We want to really focus on preparing urban educators, so we're sort of pulling the students who were previously placed in the suburbs in and placing them in your school, and we want to work with you around that. And there was some initial enthusiasm as well as some initial caution about that. As time went by, a second step is to get university faculty released from some of their teaching on campus into those schools so that we have somebody like Bob Case, who's a professor of mathematics, who now, instead of teaching all his courses in the math department at Northeastern, is released from 2 of those courses, teaches high school mathematics, does it to model that, not just for our student teachers, but also for some of the other math faculty, joins the math department at one of our partner schools as they do their professional development and as they do their planning, and also supervises student teachers from the university. So he, over the years, has become a really integral part of our partner high school. Year 1, year 2, there was a lot of, what's he doing here? How long is he going to stay around? Because we universities have a terrible reputation of dropping in, having great ideas, and walking away. By year 3 and year 4, there's a level of trust that has gotten much, much stronger. And so people now see him as one of them.
And you have to have that trust to make change,
that
don't
trust
you?
is there, and that trust takes time. As much as I have a sense of urgency, it takes time, and we've got to say we're in this for the long haul.
Well, speaking of time, you're here in Jacksonville this week to work on a number of different projects and to do some scholarly observation. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing?
Well, it's very exciting to come from Boston, Massachusetts to Jacksonville, Florida, and to see some of the same kinds of issues. And so as I was meeting earlier today with a group of high school teachers, we were having the same conversation that we have in Boston. How do we, in a high school, take seriously our role in preparing the next generation of teachers? And then how do we reach out to community agencies that have got to be the third part of this base and get them invested in teacher preparation? Get them invested in seeing that, a lot of community agencies have a lot of appropriate complaints about the schools, but they can't keep complaining unless they're willing to join the conversation, join the table, take on a role in preparing teachers, and see themselves, among many other duties, as having a responsibility to shape a generation of teachers who see themselves as having a foot in the community as well as a foot in the school, a linkage with the parents as well as with the school. And to the degree community agencies take that on, now we've begun, and it was exciting to me today here in Jacksonville to be part of a conversation that said, how do we move that forward? I think there's a great willingness, once we break out of our separate, isolated camps, to move forward in that way. And I've certainly seen it here today, so that's been terrific for me.
Well, we very much enjoyed having you at FCCJ and visiting some of the high schools with us, as we also work on our partnerships with the schools. I want to thank you so much for your time today, and how you're moving forward the dialogue about teaching urban educators in America.
It's wonderful to be with you, and this dialogue is happening in many places, and it's very exciting to see it bubble up so many different ways.
And thank you for watching today. This is Worth Quoting.
Thank you. Well, I've been having a wonderful time as I've been following Dr. Birmingham around this city the last slightly more than 24 hours now, and certainly learning a lot. A friend of mine defines an expert as somebody who's more than 80 miles from home, and since I'm a couple thousand miles from home, I'm really an expert here. But it's been we all get so parochial at times, and it's been really useful for me to step out of Northeastern, step out of Boston, be in a whole different context. I'm not responsible for anything here, and be able to really talk with different groups of people, starting with yesterday morning with Kathryn's students, and then at lunch at this A. Philip Randolph Academy, talking with folks there about the COPSI grant and ways in which that might come together, and then this morning being at the University of North Florida and talking with their education faculty about some of the very exciting things that are happening there, that I think there are some linkages worth developing. So I've been having great fun in all of this. I'm going to say just a few things about Northeastern, and we can certainly circle back to that as it's useful in the conversation. And then a little bit that I've observed in my little bit, day and a half here, and then I really talk back and forth about any issues that sparks or that you've been thinking about as we think about teacher education. When I think about how I became an education dean, and I'm the founding dean of this education school at Northeastern University, I recall the story that used to be told of John F. Kennedy when they said, President Kennedy, how'd you become a war hero? And he said, it was easy, they sunk my boat. It was easy for me to become an education dean because Northeastern decided to close its old education department and start all over again It was amidst of a major crisis, and so a president, faculty senate, and board of trustees said, we're just not going to do that anymore. We're going to do something different. Then they said to me and to the dean of arts and sciences, so you two guys go design what the different thing is and come back in 2 months with a plan for something new. It was a very exciting time in 1998 and 1999. And it happened because Massachusetts at that point instituted a new teacher test. I understand Florida has a teacher test. Somebody this morning said Florida tests anything that moves. So when the teacher test came in Massachusetts, the old education department, which had been a strong, actually, I have to be fair, it was at one time a very strong department, and it got stuck. And when academic units get stuck and years go by, they pull in, the rest of the university gets angry and withdraws resources, they pull in more, and it becomes a downward cycle. And this was a group of people who I think at one time had been a very strong unit who'd got stuck in that kind of downward cycle and couldn't break out of it. In 1998, the Massachusetts teacher test started. Northeastern ranked 5th from the bottom in the state. Front page article on the Boston Globe. The trustees of the university went crazy and said, stop, we can't do this anymore. And that was the crisis that really led to the president putting education in receivership and saying we had to do something new. It was a very hard moment. I will always remember the evening before the headline when my assistant and I had calculated what these test scores were, and I walked over to the president's office about 7 o'clock and said, Mr. President, this is what tomorrow's headline is going to say. It was not the happiest conversation I ever had with our president.
Was it after that you wrote your indictment on education?
No, I'd been writing indictments of teacher education for some...
Okay? This guy is very provocative here. In 1999, Dr. Fraser said of American education and the training of teachers, we teacher educators have sometimes been our own worst enemies, and we have too often deserved the criticism directed at us. We fail to be sufficiently rigorous in terms of content. The charge that we spend too much time on how to teach and not enough on what to teach is true. We fail to embed our programs in the daily life of schools. We've taught about schools rather than in schools. We've taught our students as if their students would be middle-class European Americans, when in reality, many of tomorrow's teachers will teach students of extraordinary racial and ethnic diversity in urban and rural areas too often marked by poverty. Indictment.
Kathryn and her husband Jerry have done this terrible thing. They keep all these things that I've said, you know. But I, in fact, had been saying variations on that theme throughout much of the 1990s as I'd gotten more and more involved as a policy person looking at teacher education. And to be frank, what happened then when we had this crisis, 1998-99, the president of the university said to me, okay, Jim, you've been a critic of teacher education for 10 years now. Do it right. Okay. And so what we were able to do, because of that extraordinary opportunity to really start all over again and design something new, was we designed a school of education that had 3 major attributes very much linked to the critique. The first was we located the School of Education in the College of Arts and Sciences. Education had at one time been, Northeastern has done teacher education since the university was founded 100 years ago. It had been a separate college. It had shrunk to a division. It had shrunk to a department. And but by this time, in the late 90s, a pretty insular department. We said, we're not going to do it that way. We're going to locate it in the College of Arts and Sciences, but not as a department. We consciously called it something different, i.e. school, to say that it's not a separate unit. It draws across all of arts and sciences. And I see some heads nodding. It seems to me you're structured to do exactly that better than almost any other place I know of. And so when we were in launching this new school, the Dean of Arts and Sciences and I wrote letters to 24 tenured faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences and offered them joint appointments in education, offered a chemist the opportunity to be professor of chemistry and education, wrote to 3 mathematicians, because we know they were interested, and offered them opportunities to be professor of mathematics and education. Of the 24 people we wrote to, 22 accepted, which was really quite amazing to me. You know, it was not just the president to me. It was us saying to other people, you've criticized education. You've been unhappy with some of the things that have happened. This is put up or shut up time. And 22 people agreed and came together and became the founding faculty of this new school of education. We then initially did a search for 4 people, eventually moved to 6, who had appointments primarily in education. But we've said to everybody we hired in the new ed school, you have to understand, if you're as an ed professor, you're going to be a minority within the education faculty. Majority of the faculty are going to be content people. That was much more than a structural issue. In fact, the structural issues were really quite secondary. The primary issue was to respond to not just my criticism, but the whole national criticism that teacher education has emphasized pedagogy too much and content too little. And we said, let's bring the people together. Let's get them in the same room in faculty meetings. Let's get them in the same room in the curriculum committee. And let's make them mutually responsible for the preparation of teachers.
Given that another indictment a lot of times is that the content folks, especially at the university level, have no idea how to teach. How did you work with, I mean, the people that you sent letters to, did you know they could teach and could teach somebody to teach? Or was it strictly that they had to know their content and be experts in the content?
We consciously selected, there's about 400 faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences, so we were quite selective in terms of who we wrote to. We selected for 2 things. One is that they could teach. And the second was that they had shown by some previous activity an interest in public education, doing work in the schools, doing volunteering, somehow had indicated to us that this was something. So it wasn't just a random group of faculty. But we did not select for the ability to teach teachers how to teach. And that was, in fact, one of the most interesting things, because what we knew at Northeastern, and what is true in most colleges and universities I know of, is that it's often the case that the arts and science faculty like to sort of sit back and say, ed school isn't doing a good job. Ed school is doing too much pedagogy. Ed school doesn't quite measure up. Yeah, that never happens here, I'm sure, but it certainly has been known to happen in other places. Suddenly, because they had the power, they also started to feel accountable, and they started to say, there's some things we don't know how to do. And so we drew, the search committee for these new slots was drawn from these 22 folks. And the first thing the search committee had to do, okay, we've been given 4 slots to launch a new ed school. These will be appointments in education. What are we looking for? First thing that came up was they said, none of us know how to really construct curriculum. We have to get a curriculum instruction professor in here. If I had gone to the arts and science faculty and said, I want to hire a curriculum instruction professor, I would have been blown out of the water. They would have said, what? Well, you don't need that. You need people who know their content. But once they became accountable for it, it really changed the dynamic. And it's really convinced me, in higher education, as in most fields, we often try to sort of amass power. You know, how much can we get under our tent? How much can we get into our silo, and then we'll take care of our silo? And what I discovered, at least in this setting, is that by giving power away, by essentially giving away the autonomy of the education faculty, we gained much more power because we had all of these allies who felt themselves suddenly accountable. I think that criticism is absolutely on target. I mean, if you look at the preparation of most college professors as opposed to public school teachers, the focus is completely on content. And some of them learn how to be great teachers, and some of them never learn how to be great teachers. And we suffer with that, and the students suffer with that. But I think the way to address that is to invite folks in, and invite them in and add that level of accountability. And again, to come back to this, it seems to me you're structured where education is so much integrated into the liberal arts already. You've got a structure in place that allows a lot of that to happen. The trick is to really get the content people at the table feeling like it's their problem. And I think there's a variety of ways to do that. I mean, a friend of mine, Arturo Pacheco, who for many years was Dean of Education at the University of Texas, El Paso, said that his first, one of the first meetings he was at the university, the chair of the mathematics department pointed to him and said, "You're the new education dean. The problem with education is that we've got all these kids coming from the El Paso public schools into this campus, and none of them know mathematics, so I have to start at the very beginning and teach them mathematics." And Arturo turned back to him and said, "Yeah, and 90% of the math teachers in the El Paso public schools were math majors in your department. So whose problem is it?" He said after that they became fast friends and were really able to work together on that. But it was an interesting beginning to the conversation. we just can't allow the ed faculty, we can't allow a structure where the ed faculty over here does pedagogy and the arts and science faculty over here does content, and the student does a kind of shuttle diplomacy. And the two groups each say, well, the problem is the other group. We've got to find different ways. I'm not saying that the Northeastern way is the way to do it for everybody, but we've got to get them together. Some colleges have created, I know that Georgia State has a teacher education council that's equal members of arts and sciences and education. Friends of mine who are there worry that sometimes those are very polite meetings, which not a lot happens in, but there's got to be various vehicles to pull the groups together. The other two elements in the School of Education, besides the arts and science link, were a very clear urban focus. Northeastern University is right in the middle of the city of Boston. In fact, we're right adjacent to Roxbury, which is the largest African-American neighborhood and one of the two poorest neighborhoods in the city. So we said, this is silly for us, launching a new ed school, fairly small ed school. We can't be all things to all people. Let's embrace our location. We had a new president who said Northeastern is an urban university, and everybody was having like, what does he mean by that? So we said, we're going to help define that. We're going to prepare city teachers. And so we ended all suburban placements, and we said from now on, the only field placements we have are going to be in city schools, mostly adjacent to the campus. It's wonderful. You can walk to most of our partner schools. But we've really focused, and we've developed in-depth relationships with 6 schools, 3 elementary schools, 3 high schools. It was such a national debate about the professional development school that we jettisoned that language and called them partner schools. But we have these 6 partner schools where we work very closely with them. And we have faculty, mostly arts and science faculty, who are now spending a part of their time in those schools, so that in one of our partner schools, which is the John D. O'Brien, supposed to be the city's flagship school in math and science, although it hasn't worked out that way. We have 2 math professors who are released from part of their teaching on campus who actually teach. One of them teaches calculus, the honors calculus course of the 12th grade. The other one teaches 9th grade algebra at the high school, and they participate in the math department so that they do the professional development not as the outside expert from the college coming in, but as part of the team. And they supervise our student teachers and interns. And they've also worked of late. One of the wonderful things is that now that high school, that isn't true across the high school, but the math department exclusively hires Northeastern graduates whenever an opening comes up. So we are getting our young graduates in, they're having them, once they get in there, Bob and Pete, who were their supervisors when they did student teaching, are still there, still attending department meetings. So they're able to have some linkages that go on over a period of time. And that's been very, very exciting to us. And one of the things I have to do next week is spend a lot of time with the foundation who's helped funded those course buyouts to make sure that they get to continue for a while longer. And then the third thing we did was to develop a set of community partnerships. We had the good fortune to have a grant from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation that said, Kellogg has funded a lot of nursing schools around the country to put nursing more into neighborhood health centers instead of into hospitals. And Kellogg picked 4 universities where they really liked what was happening in nursing, and we happened to be one of them, and said to the presidents, here's a grant, pick some other professional field and do the same thing. And we were just launching the new School of Education, and so the president called me and said, here's the grant. It was a kind of nice moment. Yeah. And we developed, then equal to our school partners, actually somewhat larger, a series of community partners. The first, our Intro to Ed course has a 30-hour field requirement, but it's not in a school. It's in a community agency. If we've done anything to transform the preparation of teachers, it's that step. It has built very important alliances between the School of Education and the community agencies. They were very suspicious at first. What do you mean you're going to, in our case, send these white kids into the black community? And they're going to come for 30 hours. That's not long enough to really do anything. And we're going to have to supervise them. Over the 5 years, I now hear the heads talking about our future teachers. They're owning them. They're owning their sense in it. And to proceed with the rest of the education curriculum, the student has to have a recommendation from their placement. So this is a very serious, and the placement people help grade the Intro to Ed course. So this has become a very serious part of the program. And the community agencies are now saying this, various ways of saying this ownership. The head of the Urban League said to me, I guess, Jim, I can't complain about the next generation of Boston teachers if I don't help prepare them. So that kind of buy-in and that kind of experience and that kind of locating our students in a sense of being accountable to urban communities is very, very important for us. You can talk about parent involvement in the classroom. You can talk about community involvement. I fear that nationally, one of the problems that the way schools have developed and the way the teaching profession has developed is it's very insular. You go into the school, you teach the kids, you teach your subject, you go home, as opposed to having this sense of linkage. We've been really able to create a sense among, not all, but many of our students, that they're accountable to the community. They're accountable to the community when they continue in their education. They're accountable to the community in terms of their thinking about their professional. In the best moments, some of them encounter the same kids when they go back as sophomores into their first school placement. And so that they've seen the kids in an after-school program, and they come back the next year and they see some of the same kids from the community in second grade or in one of the other placements. So that's been very nice. But this sense of being linked to the schools, the community organizations, and the College of Arts and Sciences has really been very valuable for us. This relates to a couple of observations, just that as in terms of what I've seen here in the last couple of days, and then I really want more conversation here. One is when we were at the high school yesterday. It was talking about the COPSI. Is everybody involved with the COPSI grant? I think it's a great gift, and I think politically, I mean, there is a hierarchy in academic institutions, and education has not been toward the top of that hierarchy. So that to the degree you're pulling in people from those other units, it strengthens the position, frankly, I mean, politically within the, at the same time, it is the right thing to do for the students in the classes. You know, that we have this pendulum swing in American education, and for the last 20 years it's been swinging toward content we all get beat up on because we don't have enough pedagogy. And I think if you look at where most schools were 20 years ago, it's a fair critique. I get really angry at the people like John Silber, former president of Boston University, who says, just give them a good liberal arts education, anybody can figure out how to teach. Well, that's nonsense. Not anybody can figure out how to teach. Some people really know their stuff and can't figure out how to connect, and connecting and making this topic interesting and engaging and helping other people learn is a different set of skills. On the other hand, if you're really good at engaging kids and making things exciting to them, but you don't know anything, there's a real limit to what you can bring. So, you know, we have to get some balance to that. I also think, I mean, in terms of what you're saying is happening here, which is also my observation, one of our other challenges is then to tell that story and to tell it in a lot of other places, because we in education are continuing to get beat up on over some charges that were pretty true 20 years ago, but are not true in many, they're still true in some places, but they're not true in many places today. And unless we start to tell our story, it's going to be harder and harder to deal with the way that I know Florida and Massachusetts are saying, all those college professors don't know what they're talking about. We're just going to do alternative certification. We're going to pull it all out of the schools. You know, I had this frustrating experience of attending AACTE, Association of Colleges of Teacher Education, a few weeks ago, and hearing the Boston Superintendent of Schools stand up, 3 ed deans sitting in the front row from Boston, and say teacher education is irrelevant to the preparation of Boston teachers, so I'm just going to do it in the district. We all said, you know, what do you know about what we're doing on our campuses? Because we've been, Northeastern is the only school that has completely shifted to doing urban teacher preparation, but the other schools that were represented in that front row look at scowling deans was all people who have done a major commitment to deep level involvement with the Boston Public Schools into preparing urban teachers. And it just doesn't get noticed. Well, that's partly our fault. We, you know, John L. Lewis said, if you don't toot your own horn, nobody else can do it for you. We have work to do, and I suspect you have work to do around that. And if we don't do that work, if we don't first fix the programs the way you're talking about, and then tell people about it, we can't really complain when the legislature says they're out of date, we're going to go do the alternative programs, much as we may all have reservations about putting bright kids in the classroom with no preparation and how long they're going to last. Ian and I had this wonderful conversation yesterday when we were over at A. Philip Randolph, and being a teacher education imperialist, I did say to the group at one point, it seems to me this whole COPSI grant could be looked at as a teacher education project. to the degree in which it could allow Florida Community College at Jacksonville to be placing students in every element of that project, to be really developing the partnership with the art organizations, with the community development organizations. It's a wonderful place for future teachers to begin to get a sense of linkages to parents and to community. Being a teacher education imperialist, I did say to the group at one point, it seems to me this whole COPSI grant could be looked at as a teacher education project. To the degree in which it could allow Florida Community College at Jacksonville to be placing students in every element of that project, to be really developing the partnership with the art organizations, with the community development organizations. It's a wonderful place for future teachers to begin to get a sense of linkages to parents and to community. And then to be pulling back from those organizations into things like your reading center, into other kinds of literacy things, where again, the way you learn how to teach a kid how to read is you teach a kid how to read. And then you reflect critically on what you've done. And this is not to say there isn't a role for classroom instruction in that, but beyond a certain point, the classroom instruction has, I think, decreasing value as opposed to practicing it. There were a lot of students here working in places like the Literacy Center and in adult education centers, dealing with adult illiteracy, dealing with early children who are having trouble in school, really helping ramp up the literacy. Linked to these community organizations, you would be offering a huge service to the community. You'd also be offering a wonderful way to get some of your students in. And at the same time, one of the high school people kept saying, well, we have high school students, 9th and 10th graders have a service learning requirement. If they get involved in that, and if they're shadowing a community college student, some of them might even decide they need to be teachers. And it's always good to be on the lookout for how do we get, if they get excited, there is that moment, we all know that from a classroom, when someone gets it, it is the most satisfying thing in the world. If we could get more 9th graders from a place like A. Philip Randolph to experience that, 4 years later, they could be in classrooms here preparing to be future teachers. And I also would guess that there are other students around the college and the different campuses who have never expressed any interest in education who through service learning could get hooked into that. We have found service learning to be one of the most effective recruiting tools for the School of Education at Northeastern. Somebody does that, they start tutoring someone, they get excited about it. Wow, maybe I could do this for a life's work. And so that's been a very effective part of that I really think the potential is just endless to keep playing that one out. It seems to me, given the articulation agreement and the numbers of your students who may be going on to the University of North Florida, it'd be very exciting to have some conversations about, could you get students which are really the freshmen and sophomores of their program into those schools at an earlier stage and begin to develop some partnerships earlier. I don't know here, but certainly in Boston, we have an articulation agreement with the 2 community colleges nearest us. But it's very hard to make that move from community college to 4-year university. If they were seeing some of the same people, if they were having a sense of some linkages there might be some very exciting things. And frankly, you might have some, this is a total guess from an outsider. You seem more linked to the community. I think you could have some things to offer to those partnerships that could be really valuable. The other real quick observation I had was really from talking with Kathryn students yesterday morning is actually there was a great division within the classroom between the ones who said, my field placement was terrific. I really feel like I became a teacher at a novice level in my placement, and others who said, my partner teacher told me, go sit in the back of the room and you can observe. And it seems to me that there may be some work to do to get those partner teachers on board. One of the reasons I don't care if you call it professional development school or partner school or whatever, but one of the great benefits that we used to have students go all over, suburbs, urban, every place, pick their own placements. By having a limited number of partner schools and saying to our students, sorry, we only can offer supervision in these places, so you only can have your placements in these schools. We've been able to develop a long-term relationship with the teachers of those schools where they have a sense of ownership about this and where they don't any longer, as they used to, say, okay, go sit in the back of the classroom, you can observe if you want to. I think it's worth thinking about pulling them in and then making sure your students are there. I mean, we can't criticize the partner teachers for not doing what we never told them we wanted them to do. And the more clarity about that, the better. I think also not only to have a sheet and somebody going out, but having them come in. We now have a lunch once a semester. It's a thank you lunch, but also a way to have some conversations about this. And also, at some level, you want to be encouraging the right people to drop into that kind of program and the right people to drop out of that kind of program. When we started our partnership with the O'Brien High School 5 years ago, there was an assistant principal at the time who said, student teachers are a perk. It means you can take longer coffee breaks because they'll cover the class for you. And so we only assign student teachers by seniority. And we said, sorry, that is not how we're going to play this game, and we will only be a partner if it's restructured. And we were able to get a complete restructuring. There were some very senior people there who, frankly, had no capacity to do supervision or no interest in doing supervision, and we got them out of doing it and other people into it. But having both the clarity and then some selection, you can get a lot done. And people self-select. If you say that the standards are, we really expect these things, people who want to use it because it's handy to have somebody give them a coffee break drop out. Either level, getting a cohort group into a school creates a sense of camaraderie. People do share. They start actually having conversations with each other about, what happened today. And that's incredibly valuable, I think. So I
know you mentioned alternative certification earlier.
Just on that topic, I've actually gotten in a fair amount of trouble writing in favor of alternative certification. There's good alternative certification, there's bad alternative certification. I am adamantly opposed to you've got a college degree, you're a teacher, alternative certification. On the other hand, there's no reason that you have to go through a particular structure. What you need to do is be able to have some way. I just don't think teaching comes naturally to most people. And there needs to be some ways you interrogate it. It does not mean you go through a 4-year baccalaureate program or you do a 1-year master's degree or whatever. And I also believe very strongly part of our role as teacher educators is always to prepare dissatisfied teachers. Schools aren't serving all kids. Schools are not yet, there are too many kids not making it. And that's our responsibility as educators. And so I think we always have to have a very close relationship, but there's some tension in the relationship between education faculty and partner schools. We need to be able to they need to prod us on the ways in which we get irrelevant at times. We need to prod them on, what about that kid sitting in the back of the class who's psychically dropped out? What's going on? Which the day-to-day pressures of running a school virtually don't allow you to pay attention if somebody else doesn't raise it. Take the cohort group thing. I mean, to take the next step and have some course, maybe it's the diversity course, where there was either the option or a norm of community agency. And then if you get the COPSI grant, you're going to have these community partners. What better way than to have some of the courses delivered on site out there to help? It sets a whole conversation going where instead of the class is here, the work is there, the two pieces get linked together, and the walls get broken down in a different way. And that becomes so important in preparing a teacher. I think both the notion that they'd be not just in schools, but in English second language centers or community centers or whatever, I think really broadens the person. I also think that the challenge, when we end up with students who are mostly white suburban, to get them thinking about being urban educators. I strongly believe that a white suburban kid can be an effective city teacher, but there's an educational process they have to go through, and it has to go through seeing themselves as linked to the community, breaking out of a certain missionary mode. People who are going to save the community are really not much use to the community, as opposed to people who see themselves aligning with the community, accountable to the community, bringing some special resources that they have. They can make an extraordinary contribution. But that conversation happens in a course like that, linked to a placement. It can't happen just in the placement, and it can't happen just in you got to have some time when you gather around the table and debrief from what happened.
Could you speak a little bit to the recruitment?
It seems to me that I haven't seen any places positioned as well as Florida Community College is to do some of that kind of recruitment. And I do think one of the reasons I come back to supporting some alternative routes to certification is that the traditional route has often been a middle-class route. I criticize the ed schools because sometimes I think they recruit middle-class kids and then prepare them as if all schools are middle-class suburban schools, and neither of which is an appropriate thing. What you've got being so located, at least this campus, in the middle of a much more diverse community, is the opportunity to recruit folks from that community into the teaching profession. And I think we can't just work with whoever happens to show up. The more you start working at that recruitment much earlier, I think, as hokey as it sometimes is, things like Future Teachers of America, if we'd had more time at A. Philip Randolph, I was going to raise that yesterday, but there ought to be some ways in which the 9th and 10th graders in a school like that have teaching presented to them as a possible profession, and presented to them, if it can be through service learning or things where they actually start doing it and start liking it, there can be some linkages. And then in a place like this campus to really be supporting students who have this incredible background. We were talking to one of Kathryn's students yesterday who's a school bus driver. Think about, she's got a whole set of the teacher ed curriculum done. She knows classroom management. She knows how to engage with kids. Doesn't mean she's got the whole curriculum done. Again, we've got this balance. How do you teach? What do you teach? There's other kinds of issues to work on. But to find folks like that and then really find every possible way to support them. The other thing is that your tuition is relatively reasonable, so that there are ways to get folks in and then support them through this program. I'm having a huge battle with our Dean of Financial Aid at Northeastern at the moment about. I want to give special preference in financial aid to city kids. We've got lots of kids out there. City kids have not had teaching presented to them as a desirable option as much as sometimes suburban kids have. And I think we have recruiting work to do. That's kind of fun. I feel like if you sort of look at some of the other conversation in American education, one of the other pendulum is we either sort of romanticize teachers. Well, if we hand everything over to the teachers, everything will be fine. Or we are forever sort of critiquing the teachers and holding everything over here. And neither of those is right. We need a much more dynamic relationship with teachers. We do need to sometimes push. On the other hand, to have teachers help edit, help shape, develops incredible alliances and lots of insight that comes into it.